Are you noticing the trend in leadership to be nurturing and to manage feelings instead of results? If so, you are not alone. While there have always been leaders who prioritize emotional comfort over performance, putting feelings before performance and accountability has become almost an expectation. Many leaders, driven by a desire to just avoid conflict and maintain harmony at all costs, are inadvertently stifling accountability and the drive for excellence within their team. For instance, consider a scenario where a team member consistently misses deadlines. And instead of addressing the issue directly, an over-nurturing leader might offer reassurance and sympathy without setting clear expectations for improvement. This approach can lead to a culture where mediocrity is tolerated and high performers feel demotivated. Does this sound familiar? Well, stay tuned as we delve into the subtle yet impactful ways that over-nurturing leadership affects team dynamics.
Welcome to Dismantling Dysfunction, a podcast series for anyone who is ready to eliminate the dysfunction they experience in their organizations, leaders, or relationships. Each week, we explore common dysfunctions in organizations, delving into the systemic causes behind them, and giving you the exact tools and practical tips you need to dismantle them. Now, here are your hosts, organizational development and behavioral change experts, Dr. Anne Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. Anne and I are continuing our series on accountability as we work to tackle the widespread issue of its dysfunction within organizations. Now, in our previous episode, we explored an emerging phenomenon in leadership, those leaders who just disappear. You know, those leaders who are anywhere but where you actually need them to be when a decision has to be made or a clarification is sought. Well, today we are continuing the conversation around those blockers to workplace accountability by focusing on the challenges posed by what we call over-nurturing leaders and the impact of their well-intentioned but ultimately harmful approach to team effectiveness. Now, before we dive in, remember, hit the notification bell. Remember to subscribe. If you're catching us on our YouTube channel, those are the places to go so you don't miss a future episode of this. If you are listening to us on our podcast, again, make sure that you've subscribed to us on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're catching us here live in LinkedIn, make sure that you are following us and connected with us so that, again, you don't miss a single episode of our conversations all around leadership and team dynamics. And if you find our content valuable, which we definitely hope you do as being part of our audience, you give us a thumbs up. Now, let's explore those subtle barriers to accountability created by those over-nurturing leaders.
I'm sure some people in our audience can't imagine what is wrong with being nurturing to their employees, but we've got a dysfunction that we're going to talk about because too much of a good thing always results in dysfunction. So hi, everyone, and welcome back, and welcome all of you newcomers to our podcast. We're glad to have everyone here. And as always, we like to point out that when we talk about dysfunctional leadership behaviors, we're usually flagging behaviors that occur when leaders don't have much training and they're over-relying on what comes natural to them. This is one of the causes of over-nurturing leaders, that they're over-relying on something that they just do naturally. And it's a topic that resonates deeply within people-centric industries such as nursing or social work or teaching, not-for-profit organizations. These sectors often attract right-brain personality types who naturally prioritize empathy and the emotional well-being of others over strict productivity and financial fiscal metrics.
It's interesting where the agenda is, so that relationship driven. And of course, these folks, they predominantly are, rooted in that feeling function of their brain, right? And at the heart, like we know this, at the heart of over-nurturing leadership lies a very noble intention. It's that desire to support and to protect team members. And their well-meaning approach can inadvertently lead to counterproductive behaviors. So leaders may offer excessive reassurance, right? And shy away from necessary constructive feedback. And we hear employees say, oh, well, they're overdoing it, and so I can't take in the information. And they can often end up showing reluctance to address underperformance directly. One of the traps they often get into is they end up doing more work than their employees in trying to address a performance gap. They tend to ask their employees, would they like to do a task, rather than delegating it and directing them and telling them what needs to be done. And they are overly concerned with being liked and trying to avoid any way that they might be perceived as being mean. And their approach, again, while empathetic and comforting, can really stifle professional growth and hinder the development of accountability within the team.
Yeah, I remember talking about this dysfunction when we talked about the matriarchal or the caretaker leadership style, but we want to flag in this behavior as a blocker to accountability, because it's all tied up in doing what we want to do as leaders too. When we're over nurturing, well, we don't want to have that difficult conversation, and so we avoid it, and instead we show empathy and compassion, focusing on feelings, not outcomes. But it creates an overall environment where subjective feelings significantly influence the decision-making process, and often at the expense of really objectively and analyzing what the decision that needs to be made, having some criteria, doing a SWOT analysis, for example. And of course, it reduces professional accountability. And this allows for what we call pseudo feelings to be presented as facts, clouding judgment and leading to decisions that might not align with the organization's best interests. A classic manifestation of this issue is when an employee expresses concerns over a potential negative reaction to accountability measures, such as saying, I feel if we hold employees accountable, they won't like it and they'll be upset, which if in the context of that culture, that can be a trigger for the whole group saying, oh, well, we better not do it. Times are tough in terms of hiring people, and we don't want to upset anybody. They might leave or they might not show up. And despite lacking evidence, this statement causes leaders to just refrain from implementing necessary performance and accountability standards, fearing to disrupt the emotional comfort of their team.
It's interesting where, we see that shift in this dynamic where, that how emotions and whatever that, the emotion that we might evoke in somebody is then where all the power lies, right? Is like, well, but they might get upset with us. And navigating this with one of our clients where we're talking about not employees, but contractors, where they're not managing the performance of contractors that are under a contract with specific terms and obligations, because those contractors might get upset. And so we can't possibly hold them accountable to our contracts. And so you see how far reaching that this can become when, like Anne was saying, where the focus is more on the fact that they might get upset with us. So they get upset. And then, but it's part of what we do and we need to deal with. And these pseudo feelings that, as used in that example there, they're emotional reactions or statements, right? They end up being treated as facts. And I can't tell you the number of times we hear this in our clients where we're having to say, okay, is that a fact or is that a feeling? Because we need to make that distinction between it. And again, it's that trigger around, this is scary. I'm afraid of what might happen or what people might feel, as though that is the driver for us in our decision making. And that speculation about possibility of a negative response is actually confused with actual feelings, right? So we then support this, emotional reasoning without objective assessments, or without even being able to say, okay, well, can we bear that? Is that, an acceptable risk that we can take within this, that, yeah, they might get upset, but it's not going to be the kind of upset where we think the world is going to end and everybody's going to walk out the door. So it's what are we being objective about in this conversation? And we've worked with organizations where like a lot of the decisions that were made by the senior management team as it related to their employee base was using this emotional reasoning. They were subjective decisions, all based on that fear of, well, they're not going to like it, or they're going to react in this particular way. And mostly what they were saying to us is, I don't want to have to navigate these feelings of these people. So don't make them upset, and then I won't have to do my job and navigate their emotional experience within it. But the worst part about it, I think, is just how it undermines the leadership and how it undermines the effectiveness of the organization, and obviously the capacity to really foster a culture of accountability and performance. And I go back to that example I started with around managing contractors, managing trades, managing even external people, and not feeling in with this dysfunction of over nurturing, where I'm prioritizing the relationship over the performance, even though there's a contractual obligation. Everybody in the organization gets stuck around this dysfunction.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Heather, because what we're talking about are leaders who can't tolerate any disharmony and any conflict. And so it really has an undermining effect on the way the organization in general makes their decisions, because a decision based on speculation rather than facts has some really harmful consequences to the organization. And if you look at where the energy is going from the leader's energy and their agenda is more to making everyone happy and helping them feel good at the expense of themselves, at the expense of the business. And the sad thing about this is how it impacts high performing people, ambitious people, those employees who want to feel a sense of mastery and achievement. And they're really motivated when they look at their leader and go, these decisions aren't grounded in reality. And, especially for those thinking type, rational decision making types of people, that they're looking for evidence or looking to their leader to say, this is how to make an effective decision. And they're not seeing it. And they don't understand, and they start losing respect for this type of leader because, when they go to their boss and say, can you tell me the rationale behind your decision around, not sticking with this policy or moving toward this goal? And if the manager says, well, a lot of people didn't like it, or they were overwhelmed by the idea of it, I mean, certain types of personalities are just going to roll their eyes around something like that. And again, just affirming this, it's most problematic for high achievers who become frustrated with the amount of time spent worrying about discussing or accommodating emotional reactions, or even speculation about how people are going to feel. They haven't even felt it. You haven't even put out the idea yet. And they're speculating about the possibility and then making a decision not to do something based on that speculation.
Yeah, and I think one of the places, as you were talking about that, I think this comes up so much with our clients, is around promotions and titles. And because it's like, well, but if I promote you, then how is everybody else going to feel? And it's like, but that's not the decision criteria here. The decision criteria is, have I earned it or have I not earned it? And I actually left my career where I used to, before I started Caliber with Anne, I worked for a large consulting firm, and I was up for full partner. And I was told I had earned it, but that they weren't going to give it to me because the other people in my peer group would be upset if I got advanced before them. So I had to wait another year until the rest of them were ready. And that was it. I was done. I pretty much within a month of that found another job, moved out of the organization. And when I said to my boss, I said, well, like, what would you have done? He said the same thing. I would have quit. And that's always stayed with me. And whenever I talk to my clients about this, is that, so yeah, those other folks were happy, and some of them are still in that organization today. But myself, as the high performer within that group, was completely dissatisfied and demotivated to the extent where I sought employment elsewhere. Because I didn't want to work in an environment where my achievements were going to be set up against the feelings of other people. Again, I'm rational left brain, totally didn't get it. I was also in my early 30s. So, put it into some context, but I see this over and over again, the same pattern, in organizations. And when you think about why are leaders doing this? Well, it's, again, they're thinking about, they're being kind and they're being supportive, but really they're avoiding any form of discomfort, which we sort of mentioned here, right? It's that, and that includes the discomfort that comes with growth and learning. And you look at my example, that the partner who was managing our office was not comfortable. One of these individuals that was going to be impacted was his direct report. He wasn't comfortable in having that conversation with them. And so instead, he figured I would suck it up and, go on my merry way and keep performing for them, right? He knew that I wasn't going to get emotional. So I was the one who was, sort of stuck in the middle of that. And it's that fear, right? It's going to hurt my relationship with my team member. And that avoidance, again, we go back to what Anne started the conversation around, which is the lack of development. We haven't given these people the skills to be able to handle these kinds of sensitive conversations, or really misunderstanding what support looks like without going into that over nurturing. And so we see then leaders may avoid these difficult conversations, and they'll opt for this sort of blanket comfort that it covers up some of these deeper issues. Well, if I don't talk about it, or I only talk to the people who can handle it and I don't talk to the other. And so it's just amazing how much work and effort goes in when we're stuck in this over nurturing pattern that leads to that lack of accountability that we're trying to break and stop the cycle of.
Yours is such a great example, Heather, of you as a high performer and the cost to an organization. And so when organizations start thinking, wow, everyone loves working for the over-nurturing leader, except for the high performers who don't want to be handled or managed or accommodated. They have other success criterias that their own agenda they're trying to achieve themselves. Certain leaders also adopt an over-nurturing approach because of personality traits or their own unresolved emotional needs. And they might seek to create a workplace environment that compensates for their own past experiences where they weren't adequately taken care of and their emotions weren't taken into account, or they were criticized, or they perceived themselves to be excessively criticized. And while creating a supportive, positive environment is really crucial, an imbalance where comfort is prioritized over accountability can really undermine the foundation of the organization. And so, for instance, a leader who consistently overlooks minor errors or missed deadlines to avoid confrontation inadvertently is sending the message that these issues aren't important. They're not worth the effort of talking about them and helping the employee master their tasks and their role.
Yeah, and we know that, one of the challenges is when, we think about these practices that leaders adopt, right? It's in the absence of, and as you mentioned earlier, in the absence of them developing other skills. So relying on their, natural orientation or on an avoidance strategy altogether, right? I don't want to make them upset. And I want everybody to be happy and everybody to love me. And so there's all kinds of things. And again, they get, leaders, we get promoted based on our technical skills, right? Or our tenure, not based on our ability to lead and manage our team effectively. I mean, everybody kind of hopes that magically that's going to come later. I mean, there are organizations that are more mature in their leadership development practices, but if we think about, more often than not, the research says that most leaders are in their role for 15 years before they get any kind of leadership training. And we then end up seeing with these leaders, they're ill-equipped to navigate the complexities of team dynamics, of performance management, ultimately, communication and accountability in the core of this. And so they, again, that default, right, is to prioritizing what feels most comfortable or familiar or what makes them feel good. And we've got some clients who definitely fall into this camp of over nurturing, where they're always doing so much for their team, and they're the ones that are always showing up with, something to give their team and some other way to make their team feel special and to be included. And again, it becomes a burden to the organization, that it's because it's more about the relationship and it's more about the experience of people, and it's not necessarily about performance and accountability in that dynamic. And so we want to really be thinking about where we've shifted into that place of prioritizing, the emotional, emotional well-being, because again, it's okay for employees to get upset at work. I mean, I do. I get frustrated, and I run the company, but I still get upset and frustrated. And that's a normal part of work life. But to sort of think that we all have to control and contain it or indulge it on the flip side is, well, how are you feeling? And these conversations I know that go on with these over nurturing leaders is, oh, you're feeling overwhelmed. Okay, well, let me take stuff off of you. Let me, again, without saying, well, what's on your plate and what do we want to do about it? And how can we reprioritize things? It's, again, we're talking about it's not that we're not talking about having empathy and really understanding where your employee is at. It's about when we are going into indulging those and catering to them and allowing that to drive our practices and our decisions, as opposed to leading the organization forward with clarity of expectation and alignment, ultimately leading to accountability.
Yeah, very, very well said. I was looking at the scales. I was envisioning scales as you were talking, Heather, and just seeing, those strengths of the people who are feeling oriented or conflict avoidant as thinking types, and how they just the weight of having to carry all of the emotions and the fear that somebody isn't going to be happy, and what that does to a leader's confidence, because it's impossible to make all of your employees happy. You're going to disappoint people. You're going to give them work that they don't like doing. But if you, to use that word that you mentioned, Heather, to indulge them by saying, oh, you don't want to? Okay, you don't have to. It means that then I have to. And that's what's problematic for people of this style. And it's really not having that self-awareness that leaders need to be aware that they're avoiding their own feelings or avoiding discomfort. They want to stay in their comfort zone where everybody loves them, thinks the world of them. They might even promote the image, that image of themselves that, oh, my people love me. I'm such a wonderful leader. But, if you heard it through the grapevine, that's not the experience employees are having with these leaders. They over empathize. They try and get thinking type people who are focused on results to talk about what they're feeling about the changes. And it's like, I don't want to talk about that. If it was me as a young person, don't ask me about my feelings. Ask me about my work and how I'm doing if I need any other resources, but don't ask me what I'm feeling about it. Leaders with high emotional intelligence are better equipped to handle difficult conversations, manage their own and others' emotions during stressful situations, and also make decisions that balance the needs of the team with the goals of the organization. And so it's that scale again where, yes, I will take your feelings into account, but we have to get this work done. We are accountable. The organization has to survive, really. But in the absence of emotional intelligence training, leaders may misunderstand the role of emotions in the workplace, either ignoring or avoiding them, or prioritizing emotional comfort over setting expectations and giving feedback.
Andy, if you think about, what happens to our team if we as leaders, again, with the best intention of thinking we're being supportive and helpful, but we actually shy away from or avoid being honest in providing feedback and or challenging the team relative to what it is they're doing from a performance perspective. And we really end up robbing our teams with that ability or the opportunity to grow and to stretch, right? And so it's like if you think about it as a parent, right? If you do everything for your child, if you go too far from a nurturing perspective where you're over involved, that child doesn't learn that autonomy. And I have some clients where again, where they're struggling with this over nurturing, and we talk about this dependency that they've now fostered in their employees on them as the leader, where they don't feel like they can go off and do anything independently or autonomously, because then they might end up hurting the feelings of the leader. And so from an accountability perspective, again, it's not the dynamic we're trying to shape and create. And again, complacency starts to creep in, mediocrity, it becomes more of the norm, because everybody's trying to stay in this place together where we're in harmony. And again, improvement, innovation is all about creating some level of disharmony in order to evolve forward. And team members really start to see that efforts and results are disconnected. It can demotivate those that strive for excellence. We've talked about that, reinforce that. And in addition, these leaders, they end up inadvertently creating an environment where feedback, even where it does occur, isn't necessarily taken seriously. It's like, it's sort of that, well, you can't really believe or trust what's being said there. And I don't know that that's really, the honest feedback, or they say that about everything. And so what do I actually take away from this conversation? And again, if the leaders are always trying to soften the blow of feedback, that sandwiching that some of us got taught when we first started leading, between excessive praise, team members really can struggle to take in the fact that there is an actual issue, because the message doesn't come across. And I even know sometimes where they're trying to deliver the feedback, and it's like, but they want to do it in a way that seems really positive and upbeat. And so the message totally goes over the head of the other person. I'm like, what was the emotion you were conveying in that conversation? Because what your words were saying and what your emotions were displaying, where I just went with everything seems fine and good, so I don't have to listen to what you're saying to me, right? So.
And one of the things we haven't touched on is, these poor leaders, when there is a culture like this, any leader who doesn't conform to this over nurturing style can get scapegoated. They are gossiped about. They're characterized as mean and cold and unfeeling, and efforts are made to discredit this person. And one of the client organizations I worked with a while ago, employees would barge into the leader's office and confront them about things that they had said in a meeting. And of course, because she didn't have any leadership training, she would go into this position of, oh my God, I've done something wrong. You're absolutely right. I'm sorry you feel that way. What can I do to make it right for you? I didn't mean it. And that defending oneself, even though in your heart, you haven't done anything wrong. And so if you've ever had the experience of a team member doing that to you, you can absolutely see that their agenda is to disempower you and get you to conform to that mediocrity that exists as a result of this over nurturing style, feelings before productivity. And it's just a couple more of the outcomes of this style before we move on to your gem, Heather, is that hindering of people's development, because they never get feedback, or they're allowed to not take the feedback seriously. And so they don't have to change anything they do. And, and here's an example. This happens all the time with many of our clients, where the leader habitually extends project deadlines to accommodate delays and never confronting the behavior of the employee. And they take away the urgency and responsibility. They'll say things like, do you have time to get this done? Without saying, I need this by the end of the day. And so there's an absence of pressure to improve, to grow, to develop. They're just enjoying that comfort zone, right? Where they're just sitting back and doing the bare minimum. and increasingly complaining about all of the little things that they don't like, with the leader jumping in and again trying to make all of their people happy instead of holding them accountable for their role.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I know we sort of emphasized, we've gone through this about, that gap that this style of leader creates. But I do want to make one comment, which is we do have clients that use this over nurturing approach, but they're also really performance oriented. And so it creates a different kind of conflict in the environment as well, where there's the messaging, which is, push and let's get it done and let's achieve these higher level results. But at the same time, it's like, oh, and how are you doing? And are you okay? And how is your emotional well-being? And let's all get together and collaborate. And so again, it still has that same impact, but don't want you to sort of necessarily associate this over nurturing with as always meaning that the team's going to be low performing. We can see it, but again, in those sorts of teams where we've got the push for the high performance along with the over nurturing, is that the leaders themselves end up getting towards burnout, where they're overextended, where they're creating this kind of false pressure on people where they don't want to not live up to the expectations of their leader, but at the same time don't feel comfortable pushing back and saying this is too much and I can't do this. And so again, all of these, because they're not effective leadership strategies, they're coping strategies that leaders use based on what comes normal and naturally to them. And we don't always stop to think about, well, is this approach having the impact that I want? And how might my approach be getting in the way or creating a dynamic that I'm not intending to create? So just being mindful about that as we go through it. So it's that time to drop the gem of the podcast. Just going to give you some specific insight that you can take away and begin to work with right away. Again, whether you identify as one of these leaders that perhaps are using these over nurturing strategies that can get in the way of accountability, or if you know of others in your organization or you're working with other leaders who present these particular behaviors. Now, this gem is a little bit three-pronged. So first, senior leaders need to have in place those systems that allow for the goal setting, the performance management, and for accountability. And again, I'm not talking about the once a year performance management process. I'm talking about that ongoing, here's the expectation, how are you doing, and holding people accountable for the delivery at the end of it. And we talk about the 6 actions. If you think back to our original podcast, when we started this series, when we went through the 6 actions associated with effective accountability, or effective practices for leaders to do in order for accountability to be present in their organization. Training for leaders on that setting and the managing of expectations, and how to resolve issues based on facts rather than outcomes and emotions must be provided. And that really helps, right? Giving that framework to our over nurturing leaders, providing them with a different way to come in and depersonalize it and focus on the issues and not on the feelings becomes really important for them in their ability to effectively navigate cross-functionally within their own teams and even up to their direct manager. And the third one is just really making sure that the leaders have those clear, unambiguous expectations with their direct reports, that we are going into that feedback. So if you're one of these leaders, it's thinking about where you haven't been honest in the feedback, or you've been avoiding giving the feedback that your employee really needs to hear, and cultivating an environment that values and encourages the sort of constructive criticism that's in our best interest for us to be going in and critiquing what's working and what's not working in order for us to continuously improve and be more effective. And that, people need to be held accountable, and these leaders need to be held accountable in particular for managing the performance of their people and not allowing their tendency or orientation towards over nurturing to be the way in which they're leading out into their group dynamic, right? So developing that emotional self-awareness, that ability to manage their emotions. I talked earlier about the importance of emotional intelligence. These are really key steps. So if you're one of these over nurturing leaders, that is absolutely where you start. Emotional self-awareness, emotional self-management, knowing when you are using this adaptive approach to over nurturing because of what you're feeling or what you're trying to not feel in your experience.
And on that brilliant note, Heather, It's a wrap for this episode of Dismantling Dysfunction. As always, we're your hosts, Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, and myself, Dr. Ann Dranitsaris. Thanks so much for listening, and join us again for our next episode where we continue talking about blockers to accountability. This one's on the hidden blockers caused by chaotic leaders, also known as the Peter Pan or entrepreneurial leadership style. These leaders are inconsistent in their vision, decision-making, and expectations, jumping from one priority to another and confusing everyone around them about what to focus on. And remember, if you're feeling challenged by the accountability gaps in your organization and want to know what you can do about the blockers that you're experiencing, why not register for our free webinar, Why Leaders Avoid Fostering Accountability. This webinar offers insight into the 4 key mistakes leaders make when it comes to creating a culture of accountability, and it gives you the exact blueprint you can implement to foster accountability in your organization.
And thank you so much for investing your valuable time and being part of our audience, whether you're catching us on our podcasts through YouTube or here as we are live on LinkedIn today. And we hope that you've gained some more insight into the competencies leaders need to master to set the stage for alignment and accountability in your organization, with a particular focus on that blocker over nurturing leaders. Don't forget, you can catch all of our LinkedIn Live videos and podcasts on our YouTube channel, Dranitsaris-Hilliard. Remember to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, sign up for us on your favorite podcast platform. However it is you consume our content, we really appreciate you being part of our audience. And if you find this information valuable, we really encourage you to share it and give us a thumbs up or give us a review or a rating. All of that helps other leaders just like you to find our content. So once again, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you again in our audience soon.
Thank you for listening to the Dismantling Dysfunction podcast with Dr. Ann Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, organizational development and behavioral change experts. Be sure to subscribe to get more practical insights and focused tools to help you dismantle dysfunction in your organizations, leaders, or relationships. For more information, visit dismantlingdysfunction.com.